We're in the middle of what many people have described as a biodiversity crisis. In fact, some people have suggested we're in the grip of what's called a sixth extinction. And the reason why is us. Purely and simply, we are affecting the environment around us, and we're doing it in lots and lots of different ways. Not just big ways like climate change, which affect things globally, but in small ways locally, like building roads and supermarkets, schools, houses, growing food, agriculture. We are encroaching on land, and we are taking that land out of the natural world, and we're using it for our own purposes. Now, we have to use land to survive. We have to have places to live and grow food, but the more that we do that, the less and less land is available for the natural world to flourish, for habitat. And it's habitat loss actually that's one of the key problems of the natural world. On top of that, of course, we also exploit the natural world. We catch fish, we hunt animals, we chop down trees for wood and charcoal and building timber. We extract gravels that change the course of water. We chuck stuff into rivers. We do all kinds of things to the natural world that degrade it. And we know that if we keep doing this, it's unsustainable. So how can we stop? And one of the ways that we can think about changing what we do is the science of conservation. But coming up with a definition of conservation is remarkably difficult. I work in conservation science, and I reckon if I got 20 colleagues in the room and asked them for definitions of conservation, I'd probably get 20 different responses, and they'd all be right. Conservation is a much more complex topic than it first appears. For a start, we have to get our head around two philosophical approaches to the natural world. Conservation, as it's understood by most people, can be summed up in a rather pithy and not necessarily very helpful response, which is the wise use of resources. But conservation has at the centre of it the idea that we are using the natural world, but we should do so in a way that's sustainable, in a way that is wise. We shouldn't harvest too many fish. We should be careful with our extraction of timber. We should be replanting forests and so on. The alternative to that is a very different way of thinking about the natural world that can operate in concert with conservation or can end up directly opposed to it. And that's called preservation. And preservation is the idea of protecting the natural world from us. You can think of it very simply. I live near a nature reserve, and that nature reserve is a preservationist nature reserve. There's literally a fence around it that stops the local farmers from using the land for grazing. We as visitors are encouraged into a car park and then corralled and marshalled down certain tracks where we can see a few things, but you can barely access a tenth of the area. It's been fortified to a certain extent with a fence around it. People are more or less excluded or very much modified and sort of controlled in the way that they behave. The alternative approach to that might be to say, well, actually some of this land is grazing land, and if it's done carefully, cattle grazing can counterintuitively actually increase the diversity of plant life. It stops any one particular species becoming dominant because the cattle will eat it down. So with careful management, the local farmer could use that area for their cattle whilst also encouraging plant life. It may be, for example, that local fishing groups want to come and fish in the river that runs through. Well, if they're going to do so in a way that's sustainable and they're going to contribute to the natural habitat, perhaps they're going to do some litter picking and they're going to maintain things. Maybe that could be a good thing, or maybe not. But the problem with conservation and preservation and trying to protect the natural world and everything else is that very often there's no right and wrong answer. And these topics can be incredibly divisive and cause amazing tensions around the world. Let me give you a couple of examples that are particularly problematic. Everyone's probably familiar with cats, right? Lovely animals. We like to stroke them and keep them as pets, but they are formidable, ruthless hunters, particularly of small birds and mammals. And if you take a cat to a new area, or you take a group of cats, they breed very well in natural environments, and you stick them in a new area, they will become a dominant predator very, very quickly. And cats being introduced to islands particularly, but also to areas where they're not native, have caused, those introductions have caused a number of extinctions of species, particularly in places like Australia and in island populations of birds. And there are a number of locations around the world currently where cats are causing a huge problem to the native fauna. So what do you do about it? Well, you don't really want cats there at all. So you need to remove them from the environment if you want the native fauna to be able to exist. So how do you remove them? One way that you could do it would be to go around and trap them all and tranquilize them and take them out of the area and put them up for adoption. Now, there's at least three problems actually with that. First of all, it's very costly to do and very difficult to do. Secondly, if you've ever been to a cat shelter, you'll know the problem is not supply. The problem is demand. There's only so many people that want a pet cat, and there's usually a bit of a surplus of abandoned pets. And on top of that, you've got the problem that in many parts of the world where cats are a problem, they're not nice domestic cats that are used to being stroked. These are feral animals that are living wild. They're not the easiest thing to find a new home for. So that is a very difficult, expensive and stressful option. Another option might be to catch them and sterilize them, which won't solve the problem in this generation, but will prevent another generation of cats coming on. Well, that's massively problematic and expensive. Probably the cheapest option is to employ people to go out and shoot them. And that's happening in many places around the world, but that is not an easy or straightforward thing to do. Because many people will say, what about the rights of the cats? It's not their fault that they're there, it's our fault. And people that want to conserve and protect the birds that are in an area or the small mammals will say, well, hang on, what about the rights of these animals to exist? And then other people will look further back and say, what about the right of the habitat and the ecosystem to exist? Because all of these animals that are being predated by cats have knock-on effects for other interactions. And every one of those perspectives is right. The problem with conservation is that lots of people are looking at it, and I'm using conservation actually in a broad term, which could also mean preservation. Lots of people are looking at this from different angles, and they're looking at it through different lenses, and they're looking at it for different end results. And these differences in perspective can cause huge tensions, particularly when large charismatic animals are involved. Here's another example. You don't get much larger and more charismatic than elephants. And elephants are incredible creatures. They're ecosystem engineers, we call them, because they can create gaps in forests, they push over trees, their enormous feet can puddle land and encourage water holes to sort of spread out and create wetlands. They've got all kinds of really interesting ecological effects, but they also can cause incredible damage. And in the natural world, perhaps centuries ago, when our influence was much less, elephants were able to move around very freely. But in the modern world, a lot of their populations have become what we call fragmented. They're separated from each other and they're unable to move freely across the landscape. And when you have elephants that would naturally move around the landscape, effectively corralled in an area, even if it's a massive area, there is the capacity for those elephants to do great damage, particularly to woodlands around rivers and so on. So we have a really interesting situation with elephants. I'm in personal touch with some people who would argue that in the areas where they live, those elephants need to be culled. And this has happened in the past. People have gone out and shot elephants because some people will say there's too many for that area. But there are other people that I know that live in areas where elephants are heavily endangered, very under pressure from poaching for their ivory. And the last thing that anyone there would be suggesting is that elephants should be culled. And then other people I know that live in communities where elephants regularly come into those communities and raid crops, damaging agriculture, damaging water supplies, and in some cases killing people. And they have a different perspective still. And then, of course, if we look at the species overall, elephants across their range, they're overall not doing particularly well, and they've recently been classified as endangered, which means lots of people in the global community have a different perspective on elephants. So conservation can be very, very difficult. It nearly always is, and there's no simple answers. But the key is to understand that there are lots of different perspectives, and that those perspectives all have equal merit when it comes to understanding what's going on. But underpinning all of this and underpinning all of our desires and aims to keep the natural world where it is a fundamental understanding of concepts like evolution, biodiversity and ecology. And without that knowledge, we won't understand what's out there in the natural world for us to protect in the first place.